This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Unions of Our Own, 8 Building Blocks to Changing Work and the World by Daniel Gross. Our workplaces urgently need to get better, but change can feel murky, daunting, or even impossible to achieve. We imagine a different world, but billionaires are doing their best to keep it out of reach. In Unions of Our Own, veteran labor organizer and co-founder of the IWW Starbucks Workers Union, Daniel Gross, provides a radically new, step-by-step framework for workers who want to dramatically improve their jobs and dream of bigger changes too. It makes clear the 8 fundamental building blocks of a union that actually embodies working class needs and values. Find Unions of Our Own at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the first episode of my 2-part interview with Molly Crabapple on her giant book, Here Where We Live Is Our Country, the story of the Jewish Bund. Molly's tale traces a long arc of history that is in turns inspiring and beautiful and then also apocalyptically catastrophic. It's a story epic in scale, a tragedy in so many senses, but it's also an account of that durable force field of solidarity and its ability to survive in the most inhospitable historical conditions. Jewish socialist intellectuals in the Russian Empire founded the Bund in 1897, and it soon became a mass organization of the Jewish working class, a racialized working class confined to the Pale of Settlement, a swath of Western provinces that now comprise parts of contemporary Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Romania, and Belarus. Jews were violently scapegoated for the ills of autocracy and class exploitation, frequently massacred by mobs with approval from the Tsarist state. Jews organized under the Bund then fought back, both for themselves and for the entire working class, becoming a vanguard of a multiracial and multinational struggle against the Tsar and for socialism, playing a leading role through the Russian Revolution of 1905 and then again in the February Revolution of 1917. From its inception, the Bund struggled against capitalists and autocrats and racist murderers alongside non-Jewish socialist comrades. They also bitterly competed with their Jewish rivals, Orthodox traditionalists, Zionists, and Bolsheviks. Amid repression and revolution, the story of the Jews of the Western Russian Empire diverges over the turn of the 20th century. Huge numbers emigrated to the Americas, more than anywhere to New York City, where they built a Yiddish-speaking socialist world, a tradition of which today's anti-Zionist socialist Jews are in many ways the inheritors. Most of the many Bundists who remained in Europe were annihilated by the Nazi Holocaust, murdered on an industrial scale among 6 million Jews of every social and political current, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish people, while the United States and other Western countries shut the door to refugees, murdered alongside millions of others, Soviets, Poles, Roma, disabled people. Bundists remained steadfastly opposed to Zionism to the end. But many Jewish Holocaust survivors, their lives and life worlds shattered, emigrated to Palestine, under the auspices of British colonialism to become settlers and then perpetrators of the Nakba. This episode starts by setting the stage for the Bund's founding in the Pale of Settlement. It ends with the Russian Revolution, a revolt which the Bund initially helped to lead, but that, after the October Revolution and the Bolshevik seizure of power, prepared the ground for the Bund's intense persecution. Stay tuned for part 2, coming very soon. Before we get this episode started, please support The Dig if you like to listen to The Dig at patreon.com/The Dig. That's the essence of the deal here. We put out every episode paywall free because we're dedicated to getting this political education into as many human being ears as possible. And it's you, our most diehard listeners, who make this model possible by voluntarily contributing. Plus, we have loads of great swag. Hit us up with a monthly or annual contribution. There's a link in the show notes. That's patreon.com/The Dig. Okay, here's Molly Crabapple, an artist and author of 3 books. Most recently, the book we're discussing today, the New York Times bestseller, Here Where We Live Is Our Country, the story of the Jewish Bund. She's won 2 Emmys and has work in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. This is part 1 of a 2-part interview. Molly Crabapple, welcome to The Dig.
I'm so happy to be here, Dan.
Before we get to the Bund, let's begin by discussing the movement's territory, its homeland. The Pale of Settlement, the territories of the Russian Empire and in Poland and thereabouts to which Jewish residence was confined. What was the Pale? How did it come about with the 1772 Prussian, Russian, and Austrian dismemberment and annexation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? And what was that world, the Pale's world, like? What sort of world was it from which the Bund, at the end of the 19th century, from which it would emerge?
The Pale of Settlement refers to the swath of Western provinces in the Russian Empire, to which the vast majority of the empire's Jews were legally confined. It came about after the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when Russia, Prussia, and the Habsburg Empire sliced Poland up and each gave themselves chunks of land. Now, Poland, or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at this time, was a home to a massive Jewish population that had come there after Jews were expelled from Germany during the Crusades, after Jews were expelled and kicked out from this duchy and that duchy all over Europe. They were invited by King Casimir the Great to settle in Poland, where they played a very typical, what you would call middleman role, working as, tavern owners, small tradesmen, tax collectors for the estates of Polish lords, and where Jews constructed these small towns called shtetls. Now, the Russian Empire was an autocracy. It was also an empire that drew a lot of its legitimacy from the powerful Russian Orthodox Church. And as soon as it acquired these territories and their massive Jewish population, it worried, what are we going to do about these people? What are we going to do about these non-Christian people who are working in trades, who might compete with our tradesmen, who have these quasi self-sustaining communities? What are we going to do? And the Tsarist Empire developed entire bodies of laws to restrain the new Jewish subjects that they had acquired. The most important one was defining these Western provinces as the zone that Jews were allowed to live in. And this didn't refer to all Jews in the Tsarist Empire, because there were other Bukharian Jews in Uzbekistan. There were, Jewish communities in Georgia that were called the Mountain Jews. This really was about like Eastern European Jews, which is, millions of people. So they define this swath of territories that goes from like Dvinsk, Daugava Pilsnow in the north to Odessa in the south. Like, this is where you were stuck. They make further sorts of restrictions that Jews can't live in the countryside. They have to live in towns. They make restrictions on what sorts of jobs they could do. Later, there are restrictions on how many Jews could go to gymnasiums being like the Russian Empire version of high schools, and also how many Jews could go to university. They, at one point, have a term of military conscription for Jews that is 25 years long and starts at age 12, as opposed to 5 years long and starting, I want to say, at age 18 for Christian subjects. And the explicit reason for this huge term of military service was to force Jews to convert. Now, these Jewish communities, these shtetls, were also places that had their own internal hierarchies. And one of the internal means of self-organization was called the Kehillah. And this was a council of like rabbis and pious notables that would adjudicate communal matters while also dealing with the Russian authorities. So it was the Kehillah, for instance, that would come up with the quota of young Jewish boys that were going to do military service. It was also the Kehillah that, if they heard rumors of a pogrom, would try to raise money for a fat bribe to keep that pogrom from happening. In these Jewish communities, typically, Jewish people most of them were quite poor. They worked as small tradesmen or as workers in cottage industries, working in like home tailoring. Sweatshops was pretty typical, brush making, leather tanning. That was what my great-grandfather did. Also, there were market days in these towns where peasants would come from the surrounding countryside to sell their crops and then to buy finished goods from Jews and to get really, really drunk at Jewish-owned taverns. And these market days were often an occasion both for relationships, right? But also for problems, because whenever people are arguing about money, that always makes a moment for other sorts of more passionate disputes to break out. Now, these Jewish communities were also extremely religious. There wasn't necessarily the idea of, a secular identity in the Russian Empire in 1850, right? A Jewish woman like my great-great-grandmother, Chaya Rachel, could be expected to marry at age 14, to devote her life to like running a kosher Jewish house, having children, and also working, because the ideal version of Jewish life was one where men would get to study Torah and Talmud, and women like my great-great-grandmother would like run a small flour mill and support them. It's almost like a patriarchal grad school, let's say. And they were also places that were not cut off from the larger non-Jewish world. Volkovisk, the small town where my great-grandfather was from, it was about half Christian, a quarter Polish, a quarter Belarusian, and had some Muslims in it. These were like tight-knit Jewish communities, but it was not like it was not something where they never dealt with non-Jewish people. They were also communities where education was really valued. Boys typically would be expected to be literate, which would not be the case for, a poor like Russian or Polish boy. And where the traditional means of education was something called a cheder, which is a religious school where you learn to read Hebrew, and then you study the Torah, the Talmud, the Gemara, and a lot of it is done like through rote memorization. Your teacher will beat your ass if you're not paying attention. So, a traditional life that's confined both by the larger Russian government, but also by your own communal authorities.
What was the structure of anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire? What were its origins? What was its logic and function within both the Tsarist political order and also within Polish and Russian society? And then how was that anti-Semitism operationalized both through the geographic and occupational segregation that you already got into, but also through the terror of pogroms?
The anti-Semitism that was at play in the Tsarist Empire, there were two sort of sources for it. The first one is just the classical Christian thing, right? That Jews killed Jesus and then they didn't even have the decency to believe in him afterwards. Classic, old school stuff that we're familiar with Catholicism that was no less important in Eastern Orthodoxy. So that's one side. But another thing is that in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Jews, and not all Jews, but a lot of Jews were middlemen, right? Like the Polish lord would own the land, but he might employ a Jewish supervisor to go and like collect taxes from the peasants who would be in that land, who might be Ukrainian, for instance. When there was in the 17th century the Chelmitsky uprising, which is an uprising that's like completely foundational to Ukrainian national identity, this was also the mass slaughter, not just of Polish lords, but of Jewish, tax collectors, tavern owners, and just Jewish people writ large. The Chelmitsky uprising is one of like the great mass murders of Jewish history, but it was framed very much in the way that like Jews were collaborators of the Poles, which then got into all of the like classic anti-Semitic stuff about like, being blood-sucking middlemen. We know this. But, the truth was that the power did not actually lie with these Jewish middlemen. The power lay with the Polish lords. And it was similar with the role of Jews as tavern owners. So as an example, in the old school Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and later in, to some extent in the Russian Empire, the lords would have the exclusive right to make alcohol on their land. And they would be the ones, who profited from it. But they would not be the ones who were cleaning bars and filling glasses at a tavern. A lord doesn't do that, right? They get someone else to do that. And so in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Jews traditionally worked as tavern owners. But the monopoly and the real profit from liquor was something that the Polish lords had and derived. And of course, this was something that led to anger, the same way that it was very classic when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. There was a lot of conflicts between immigrants that ran like small convenience stores and poor people in the neighborhoods that would buy from these stores, even though the immigrants were also dirt poor themselves. And this is just like a classic way that capitalism, but also early modern, like late feudalism, draws divides in between people and pits the working class against this, like, you would call it petty bourgeoisie, but they're also quite impoverished themselves. And particularly Jews served a really important scapegoat function because the anger of the peasantry could be diverted onto the Jewish tax collector or the Jewish tavern owner and away from the Polish lord, who was actually the person deriving all of the profits, or away from the Russian lord for that matter.
How did the Bund emerge when it did and where it did from the various radical currents that you trace that are at this time, during this era, circulating across Russia and across Europe? And more specifically, how did it emerge from within the society of the Pale, from the Pale, a Jewish community where Moskalim at this time, Moskalim followers of the Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah, where they were, during this period in the late 19th century, contesting traditionalist Orthodox shtetl Jews for influence and power?
So Russia is a hereditary autocracy, and it's also a country that is shaped by the institution of serfdom, which is not It's not exactly the same as chattel slavery at all, but it's certainly a cousin to it. It's the idea that there are groups of people called serfs that are bound to the land. And when you buy land, you buy the people, and the people, they work on that land, and they do not have the right to leave that land and start new lives elsewhere. They are your workers that you more or less own. Serfdom is abolished by Tsar Alexander II in 1861, which is around the time that slavery is abolished in America. And for this, Tsar Alexander II is heralded throughout the country as, Tsar Liberator. He's called, the Great Reformer. And at the same time as he is ending serfdom, which, by the way, I need to say he's quite inadequate with. Serfs literally have to toil to pay back the prices of their freedom. But nonetheless, he does end serfdom. At the same time as he's doing that, he is also easing the restrictions against Russian Jews. And by this time, there are a block of middle and upper class Russian Jews who are followers of a movement called the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment, which is a movement to sort of put Jews in the same sort of European modernity as their fellow Frenchmen or Germans might have been. It's the idea that you can both be a modern citizen of your country and also a believing Jew. There's a line that is by a famous Maskil that says, "Be a Jew at home and a man on the street," which I always thought when I heard that, I was like, are not Jews men? It makes a dichotomy, right, of being a Jew and a human. But anyway, there's this idea that you can, assimilate in a lot of ways into your society while still being a proud Jew. And this is something that you see with Moses Mendelssohn in Germany, with Rachel Varnhagen, this idea that, learn the language, learn to speak your beautiful French or German, shave your face, wear your suit, stop speaking Yiddish, get a respectable job, don't be like some grubby pushcart trader like your grandfather, and prove that you're civilized enough to deserve civil rights. And, it's something also that's very tied with the emancipation of Jews, right, in Western Europe. And so in Tsar Alexander II, Russia's maskilim really think that they found their champion, that this is going to be the guy that will remove the boot from their face and will let them transcend the confinement of the Pale of Settlement and become equal Russian Pushkin-quoting citizens, right? But at the same time, the inadequacy of the reforms of Tsar Alexander II are starting to breed massive frustrations, and new radical youth movements are emerging. The most famous of one to history is the Narodniks, which are a group of agrarian populist socialists who believed that, the answers to creating utopia were to be found in the indigenously socialist Russian peasant society, right? They're complete romantics about the Russian peasantry. And by the late 1870s, they do a movement where they decide that they will go to the countryside and try to preach to the Russian peasantry about why they need to do a big-ass revolution and overthrow the Tsar. This goes about as well as you might imagine, and the Russian peasantry turns them immediately into the police. The disappointment of the failure of going to the countryside will lead these young Narodniks into more radical directions. And these become the first people that I know of in history that refer to themselves and not just their enemies as terrorists. And in 1882, a group of Narodnik-inspired young people who call themselves the People's Will assassinate Tsar Alexander II with a series of bombs. And one of these young people, the young woman who runs the safe house for these assassins, is a Jewish seamstress from Kyiv named Hesia Helfman. Now, the assassination of a czar is a massive shock to Russia. Tsar Alexander III, the ultra-conservative heir to the assassinated Tsar Liberator Alexander II, he will draw several lessons from his father's murder. And those are crush dissent without mercy, never do reforms, they make you seem weak, and do not trust the Jews. And in May 1882, he brings back all of the old anti-Semitic laws that his dad has overturned. And not just the pogroms, but also the futurelessness imposed by these laws will set off the first great wave of mass Jewish migration out of the Tsarist Empire. By the time that World War I starts, 1/3 of all of the Jews in the Tsarist Empire have left, and the majority of them have come to New York City. Now, the Bund did not emerge from a peasant populist milieu. They emerged from a different tendency, and that was the tendency of Russian Marxism. The young people who would create the Bund were deeply shaped by the ideas of Marx, of Karl Kautsky, and by the first Russian Marxist, Georgy Plekhanov, who has been presiding over courts of worshipful students in his Swiss exile. And many of these students have been smuggling pamphlets back across the border. Now, the type of young Jews who created the Bund, they were middle-class kids. They spoke Russian rather than Yiddish, which was the language of working-class Jews. They first came to revolutionary organizing with all of the arrogance and cluelessness that we know so well from a PSL chapter trying to set up a book club in Brooklyn. We know what it's like. The theory of how revolutionary organizing was supposed to work in Russia, and the theory that these young Jewish Marxists subscribed to, was that Russian workers were incredibly, incredibly stupid. They were uneducated, they were backwards, there was no way that these dumbasses could possibly make a revolution. So what you needed to do is you needed to set up study circles. And these study circles would educate workers, make them conscious in the revolutionary parlance of the day. And then these conscious, educated workers would recruit more workers for your study circles. And then they would recruit more workers. And eventually, when you had enough workers who had attended your study circles, revolution. It reminds me of the underwear gnomes in South Park. Step 1, collect underwear. Step 2, ... Step 3, profit. They were like, step 1, study circle. Step 2, ... Step 3, revolution. And this crew of young Jewish Marxists called the Vilna Group, people like Patty Kremer, Arkady Kremer, John Mill, Lyuba Levinson, they get their start by holding study circles for workers. And these study circles have an additional aspect in that because Jewish workers spoke Yiddish, not Russian, the study circles also focused on teaching these Jewish workers to be able to read and write and speak Russian, because Russian was the language that you needed if you were going to read theoretical Marxist texts. Now, this would seem like it would be a massively unpopular idea, but because the culture of these like working class Jewish communities in the Pale of Settlement was a culture that so worshipped books and so worshipped education, and because education was something that Jews were highly restricted from, especially, God forbid, you were poor, you were working class, you were a woman, these study circles became massively, massively popular. And for years, Patty Kremer, Arkady Kremer are going to just be instructing groups of young Jews about Darwin and Marx and life in China. But after a half decade of these study circles, they realized that they are no closer to revolution than before, that the workers that they instructed were not organizing a proletariat to overthrow the Tsar. Instead, they were carrying around large books that they could half read to seem impressive. They were posturing like very fancy intellectuals, and they were trying to take their college entrance exams so that they could be intellectuals just like these young Marxist teachers of theirs. Basically, the study circles, they were meant to create revolutionaries. Instead, they created hipsters. And the young Marxists decided that they would have to try a different tactic. Now, this should be shocking, but it turns out that workers do not need Marxists to tell them that their wages are too low and that their hours are too long. It turns out workers can figure that shit out for themselves. And at the same time as Arkady and Patty are creating their coterie of nerds in a variety of, attics around Vilna, there is the rudiments of a trade union movement that is being established by Jewish workers, including, young Jewish women. And these workers are organizing like mutual aid funds where they will pool their meager earnings so that they can have enough money to sustain them through a strike. They're organizing strikes. They are organizing detachments of burly guys to defend their picket lines. They are doing all of that. And so the real breakthrough of our young Jewish Marxist heroes is they turn their eyes away from the study circle and towards the actual working class. And they think maybe what we need to do is, instead of telling the working class how to be smart, maybe we need to learn from them. And maybe we need to use our skills to help them do what they want. Maybe we need to use the fact that we're literate, the fact that we can read the meager corpuses of employment law, the fact that we know people in other cities, other countries, we can print pamphlets, we have all of these skills. Why don't we use that to help workers organize themselves? And this move from huffing theory to doing practice is the breakthrough that will make the Vilna group explode and will set the stage for them becoming the Bund.
19th century European radicalism facilitated the emergence of just a huge variety of socialist ideologies and modes of organization. What sort of socialism did the Bund articulate? What made it particularly Jewish, and then what made it not particularly Jewish at all, in that it was emphatically a universalist project for human emancipation? How did their vision emphasize multi-ethnic working class unity, rejecting both assimilationism and nationalism?
The Bund emerged in this milieu where Jewish workers basically had three boots smashing on their face, right? First, they lived in the Tsarist Empire, an autocracy run by inbred idiots who squandered the country's money on little diamond eggs that opened to little diamond birds. They lived in a place with no free press, with no parliament that meant anything. They lived in a place where protests were put down by mounted cavalry called Cossacks, a place where having a reading group could get you sent to Siberia. Everyone in the Tsarist Empire was oppressed, all, full stop. But they also lived in a place where Jews were a racialized minority, where they had a whole body of laws that restricted their lives, and where, because they were targeted by the government, they were also targeted by popular hatred and violence, including by pogroms. And, sometimes people have this vision of what a pogrom is. I guess it's from Fiddler on the Roof, where they think it's just slashing open a duvet and feathers going everywhere. No, these are acts of world-shattering violence that sometimes will lead to hundreds and hundreds of people being slaughtered over the course of several days. And these are, acts of popular terror that were not organized by the state, but were certainly, looked the other way at by the state. So this position where Jewish workers in the Russian Empire, they're oppressed by the autocracy, they're oppressed as all workers are under capitalism, but they're also oppressed, Jews specifically, leads the Bundists to this insight that Jews are oppressed as both a race and a class. And I'm just going to read from an amazing speech by Yuli Martov, who was a member of the Vilna group before he would go on to be the leader of the Mensheviks. So in the speech that Martov gives on May Day, 1894 in Vilna, he says that Jewish workers are oppressed both as workers and as Jews, as a race and as a class. And he says, quote, they cannot rely solely on the Russian or Polish proletariat, which might, sell them out for profit. Instead, they must, quote, fight as an organized Jewish group alongside other groups for economic, civic, and political liberty. So what do you have there? You have first the notion that Jews, as an oppressed and racialized minority, have to organize themselves, but not as a segregationist or separatist project. They have to organize themselves to fight for their specific rights while fighting alongside other people who are different from them for socialism, for the end of the autocracy, and for the better and more beautiful world. And that is going to be the defining ethos of the Bund. The idea that you can both fight for your liberation as a Jewish person, for your freedom from racist laws, for your culture, for your right to speak your own language, while also fighting in solidarity and alongside all of the other people in Eastern Europe for a better tomorrow. It was a way of balancing both the universalist aspirations of Marxism with the reality of who they were as an oppressed and racialized group that had its own language and its own culture. And when the Bund is officially founded in 1897 in a Vilna safe house, the founder, Arkady Kremer, says that they need an autonomous organization of the Jewish proletariat. And he says, that is because Jewish workers suffer not only as workers, but also as Jews, and we dare not and cannot remain indifferent at such a time. And some months after the Bund is founded, they will join the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the first Marxist party in the Russian Empire. They will join it as an autonomous organization of the Jewish proletariat. They will join it as equals.
The 19th century, as we've discussed, it occasioned this just explosion of revolutionary politics across Europe. The story of the Bund ends, in many senses, truly horrifically with the Holocaust, as we'll get to by the end of this interview. And Nazi ideology, as we'll also discuss later on, it was fundamentally organized around anti-communism and anti-Semitism, two things that were truly fundamentally intertwined for the Nazis. How in the late 19th century already did European ruling classes and reactionaries begin to associate and conflate socialism and revolutionary democratic politics with Jews? In Russia, I take it that the assassination of Tsar Alexander II was a pivotal moment, but this is a much broader phenomenon that becomes central to reactionary politics across the region.
No, absolutely. So obviously, the majority of Jews in the Russian Empire were not revolutionaries. The majority of any group of people just want to, live their lives and don't usually have any great political view at all. But a very disproportionate number of Russian revolutionaries of all stripes were Jewish. And this is not just the case for the Bund. This is the case if you're talking about the socialist revolutionaries who are the populist heirs to the Narodniks. This is the case if you're talking about the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, writ more broadly, the party that would spawn both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, and eventually through a variety of twists and turns would become the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This is the case if you're talking about anarchists. And why were so many Jews in the Russian Empire revolutionary? I think it's pretty obvious. They were revolutionary because they were being victimized by the state. And when you were specifically victimized by a state, when a state specifically has the boot on your neck, you want the boot off of your neck, right? It's a pretty obvious thing. But the prevalence of Jews in revolutionary movements becomes a way that the Tsarist Empire will try to discredit those same movements. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was printed on Tsarist secret police printing presses and distributed by undercover agents, is one of the many ways that they tried to associate revolutionary and Jew, to make them synonymous. But it's also true that many young Jewish people, they wanted out of the hemophiliac autocracy. They wanted revolution. They wanted modernity. They wanted to create the better and more beautiful world, and they were willing to fight for that. And I mean, for me, as a Jewish person who grew up in a leftist home, that's a heritage to be proud of.
How did the Bund make sense of the place of Jews in an extraordinarily hostile Russian Empire? And more specifically, how did they articulate this promise of solidarity with non-Jewish workers who were also so often their persecutors? I mean, this is a theme that we'll return to throughout the interview. It's a level of commitment to universal humanistic principle in the face of such devastating oppression that it's really quite amazing. Like a faith in humanity in moments when all evidence is pointing in the opposite direction repeatedly.
I mean, the Bund blamed reactionary governments for anti-Semitism. They thought that anti-Semitism and like racism, writ more largely, were tools by the ruling class to divide workers and keep them at each other's throats rather than fighting for their real interests. And I mean, I think that the Bund, wasn't alone in that. Like, I think that's how most socialist groups understood anti-Semitism at the time. They didn't think that it was something that was just like born into, non-Jewish people. They didn't think that like people who aren't Jewish had like some switch in their brains that hated Jews. They thought that this was something that they were taught by capitalists, by reactionary politicians, by a reactionary church in order to keep power in power. And when the Bund was looking at the Jewish working class in the Pale of Settlement, they weren't just seeing people that were victims of anti-Semitism. They were also seeing people who were victimized by the fact that they were forced to, work in industries that were in many ways more powerless industries. If you are a worker who is working on the railway or the telegraphs, you can grind an empire to a halt in one day by withholding your labor. Whereas if you're working, making brushes or tailoring dresses, just your power is so much more limited, right? They saw Jews as people who were stuck in poverty because they weren't allowed to leave the Pale of Settlement, and so they couldn't go to, find better employment opportunities the way that other people could. But they were also, highly critical of the Jewish bourgeoisie. They were highly critical of religious leaders. I mean, sometimes the Bund could be dickishly anti-religious. There's no other way to describe it in the early days. These are people who would swagger around on Yom Kippur smoking a cigarette with their girlfriend. These are people who would slap up a poster on the wall of a synagogue on Friday night because they knew no one could take it down till Saturday night. These were people who would take over the synagogue at gunpoint to stage debates. That is the level of challenge, of like real youth rebellion that was embedded in how the Bund operated.
And they would like flaunt eating pork.
Yeah, they would flaunt eating pork. They were jerks, right? And it came from a specific context, right? There were also people who, when they were kids, got their ass beat by their teachers in religious school, but they were jerks. And these Bundists, they also saw an immense amount of beauty and richness in Jewish life, in the songs and the customs, in the language, Yiddish. Yiddish is like the ultimate diasporic language. It's comes from medieval German. It has has Hebrew letters. It has a bunch of Hebrew vocabulary, but it also takes vocabulary from every single place that its speakers pass through. There's a line that by the Bundist Max Weinreich that a dialect is just a language without a navy. And that is a line about Yiddish, meaning that the difference in a dialect and a language is the ability to inflict state violence at distance. But, so they saw, even while they were like highly critical of traditional Jewish life, highly critical of traditional Jewish authorities, even as they were incredibly cognizant of the restriction and violence of the empire, they also saw so much beauty and strength in the Jewish working class of Eastern Europe. And, they saw people, right? Now, in terms of their faith in solidarity, this was not a naive faith. They were not people who were like, oh, we can just hug it out. We can just show what like nice people we were, and the Christian workers will love us. They were not like that. They lived in the real world. And in fact, one of their most important institutions in the early years in the Russian Empire were self-defense groups that they made. These are, armed groups armed with guns and knives that were formed to beat back pogroms. But at the end of the day, when I see how the Bund wrote about pogroms, I remember I was reading Geschichte von Bund, which is the deadly dull official history that in granular detail, it describes every single pogrom that the Bund fought against between 1900 and 1905. It's real nerd shit. When I was reading that, and I read how this writer, who's a Bundist writing after the war in New York, talks about these pogroms, they always talk about them as being stirred up by undercover police agents or by the state. And they always really emphasize how the state would spread lies about Jews in order to start these pogroms, even spreading lies that Jews were going to burn down churches, right? Or that Jews wanted to replace the czar with a Jewish czar, crazy batshit. And so they were utterly committed to defending themselves while at the same time having a larger analysis. And one of the things that they really tried to do is they tried to work with other revolutionary movements that were led by non-Jews. And that's, one of the reasons why they were part of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. But in addition to that, they would print pamphlets in Russian, and they would go out and speak to peasants and non-Jewish workers and try to just organize just as dead up Marxists based on, their mutual interests as working class people. They really thought that there was a great value in working class union organizing. They thought that organizing and winning material victories together was something that could overcome racism. They also believed that one of the ways that Jews would overcome not just the degradation imposed on them by the Tsarist regime, but also the self-hatred that's imposed on you when you are so oppressed, is by militantly standing up for their rights and fighting for them. They saw their self-defense almost as a way to remake who they were and to assert their dignity.
I want to unpack a little part of your last answer in terms of the Bund's conflict with kind of the traditional religious social order, because the Bund really entailed a social revolution within the Pale. It entailed a social revolution in terms of the sort of pride and confidence and kind of remaking of collective identity that comes with organized self-defense. And it also, in particular, was a social revolution for women whose role and kind of position in society the Bund articulated an extraordinarily different vision of from the traditional Orthodox shtetl leadership. What did that conflict look like? How did it play out, and how was it experienced by ordinary Jews in the Pale?
And one of the things is when you read these, memoirs of young Bundists, right, you hear constant stories about these conflicts within families. For instance, for a young Jewish person from a traditional family to be sneaking out to the woods on Sabbath, for a young girl from a traditional family to be making friends with men, dating, oh my God, right? Foregoing early marriage, to, eat non-kosher food. Just that, right? Just the mere fact of eating non-kosher food. And there's a strictness to the type of Orthodox Jewish life that was lived in the shtetl that I think would be very unfamiliar to most people in America who maybe didn't come from a Hasidic family. For instance, you weren't supposed to carry anything on Saturday. The fact that if you went around on Saturday carrying a stick, you are a heretic, bad, right? So all of these things, right down to the most minor detail, like walking around on Saturday with a walking stick, this involved a major defiance of familial authority. Also, one of the things with women in the late 19th, early 20th century in the Pale of Settlement is they always worked, right? There was not this idea that girls would be protected at home until they, got married and they would become a homemaker. These women in the Pale of Settlement, these girls were working in factories, right, to raise enough money for their dowry. Married women were running shops. They were running stalls. These are like sharp-elbowed, tough, women, confident and interfacing with the world. So it wasn't, I think, the sort of imagining that sometimes we have in America where just the act of, going off to work would be a huge rebellion. It wasn't that. But the rebellion was that you were not obeying your father's authority. You were waiting to get married, not having an arranged marriage. You were violating Shabbos, that you were sneaking off and, to do God knows what, God knows where. And even reading secular books, and I don't mean Marxist radical texts, I mean books of math or, Jules Verne or something. Even that for a traditional, not like a Maskalim family, but just a traditional, pious, normal family, even that was a huge challenge to the established order. I mean, I would read stories about Jewish kids from these very pious families, sneaking out to go to secular school, and for a young woman, especially, a young working class woman, to join the Bund, I mean, you were entering into the most exciting sort of subculture in the world. You were radically expanding your possibilities in life. It was like you were blowing open your doors to the universe, both intellectually, socially, romantically, everything.
As you mentioned earlier, in the late 19th and early 20th century, just a huge number of Jews from across the Russian Empire, I think you said about a third, left. Most sailed to the Americas, and they were fleeing, economic conditions, but also, of course, these renewed anti-Semitic laws and pogroms after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Parts of my wife Thea's family traveled to Argentina. Other parts went to New York City, which is where your great-grandfather, a Bundist, arrived in, I think, 1904. And so in New York, first on the Lower East Side, then into Brooklyn and across the boroughs, Jewish immigrants from the Pale of Settlement built a powerful Yiddish-speaking socialist politics, really an entire immigrant Yiddish socialist world with newspapers, labor unions, social clubs of all sorts, political organizations. What did Jewish socialism look like when it took root and then blossomed in New York? And how did it wasn't just kind of transplanting Bundism to New York. It emerged in particular, you write, from an encounter with those Jewish immigrants, German socialist exile neighbors. What sort of political and social world did they build, and how did it all take shape in the first place?
For anyone who's interested in this, there is an amazing book by Tony Michaels called Fire in Their Hearts. That's kind of the Bible on this. So I must, bow down to Tony a bit. But the world of Yiddish socialism really emerges before the Bund. It comes out of this encounter between young Russian Jewish radicals, particularly and most importantly, a guy named Abraham Kahan, who are fleeing the repressions in the aftermath of Tsar Alexander II's murder. They roll up in New York City, and for the first time, they are forced to labor alongside a Jewish proletariat that they had, of course, read about in pamphlets and, of course, thought were an agent of history, but really preferred to, deal with from afar. And at first, Abe Kahan and his friends, they mostly devoted themselves to giving pompous speeches about overthrowing the Tsar and bemoaning the fact that they had to work at sweatshops, in this new city.
Alongside these Yiddish-speaking hicks, basically.
These Yiddish, yeah. Just Yiddish-speaking workers, right? Not politicized people, just working Joes. But the thing that shifts how they think is that at the same time, there are all of these German socialists in New York who have been kicked out by Bismarck and his anti-socialist repressions. And all of these socialists are meeting and mingling at, cafe tables, at, lecture halls. New York has always been a capital for radical diaspora writ large. Like everyone from like Chinese radicals to Armenian radicals to Puerto Rican radicals is in New York, getting their fundraising on, arguing, and building their strength to bring about the utopia in their respective countries. So there's just like a lot of intermingling between diasporas. And these Jewish socialists like Abe Cohen meet these German socialists. And the Germans are like, my man, why are you just giving speeches about overthrowing the czar? That doesn't really seem like it's doing much. You are working alongside a massive Jewish proletariat. And this Jewish proletariat, they're not marginal to the city. They are the backbone of one of the most important industries in the city, which is the garment industry. So why don't you organize them? Why don't you try that? Think about that. And so Abe Cohen and his comrades start doing that. They start working in Yiddish. They create forwards, called the Forward in English. It's probably how people would be most familiar with it, which at the time is a massive publication, and it is the publication of Yiddish socialism. Other Jewish socialists, they start organizing garment unions. They start, organizing like debate societies, lecture societies. There's a secular socialist mutual aid society called the Workmen's Circle that does everything from like provide death benefits and health insurance to take Jewish workers on tours of the Museum of Modern Art to expose them to Rembrandt. They build an entire Yiddish socialist world. And in large part, they're able to do that in America because in America, unlike Russia, Jews have an unprecedented amount of political freedom. They're not living in an autocracy anymore. They're living in a democracy. They can organize unions. They can write freely in Yiddish. They can, contest for political power, run for office. Jews in New York will play a huge role in the Socialist Party in America. The Jewish socialist Meyer London will become the second socialist congressman ever in American history. And incidentally, he's actually running in the same district that Brad Lander, Zohran Mamdani's friend, is running right now. The history, it rhymes. And this is a world that is capable of leveraging massive strikes, that it's also a world that benefits from the economies of scale. New York City was and is the largest Jewish city in the world. It is and was a massive, rich, cosmopolitan metropolis where even a broke-ass worker probably makes a lot more than they would doing their broke-ass work at home, and so can send some money back to fund a revolution elsewhere. This happens then and now. And it was a place where organizing was possible. And of course, a lot of this benefited from the fact that while Jews were the official underclass and scapegoat of Tsarist Russia, that was not the case in America. America is built on the genocide of indigenous people and on the enslavement of Black people. And in a lot of ways, every other bigotry that America holds, and it's held 1 million violent bigotries, is really much more subject to geopolitics and economics and is easily shrugged off when things change. And that was certainly the case for Jews. When Jews landed in the late 19th century, there was, a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of crap with other immigrant groups, their quotas in universities or whatever.
But it wasn't like the Pale.
No, it was nothing like the Pale. It was nothing like the Pale. And also, one of the strange things that I found when I was doing this newspaper research is that the same newspapers that would indifferently shrug off the lynchings of Black people would be writing these stories about the pogroms in Russia and just being like, wow, these poor Jews, oh my God, look at the savage Russians. It was almost like they couldn't see that the exact same behaviors were being carried out by Americans just against a different group.
Which Jewish New Yorkers did
Jewish New Yorkers definitely
the Jewish
did.
Press certainly did cover.
Yes, the Jewish press covered lynchings, which they called the violent white riots that were tearing through the South, pogroms. It's so funny. Sometimes, like establishment Jewish places now, they get so grabby about certain words in Jewish history, like pogroms. They're like, it's my toy, it's my toy. But if you ever actually read the Yiddish press, you would know that they constantly referred to stuff like Tulsa as pogroms. It's utterly ahistorical. But anyway, I digress, right? And the Yiddish press, which was, again, it was free, it was verbose, it was radical. This Yiddish press was getting smuggled back into the Pale of Settlement, and it was actually inspiring the Yiddish press there. At the same time as you have young Jewish Marxists like Patty Kremer running their impotent little lecture groups in the Pale of Settlement, the Jews in the New York garment unions are bringing their entire industry to a halt. That gives you an idea of the difference in power. And also in terms of money. So, Jews in the Lower Side, they were poor, right? These are poor, exploited people working at sweatshops, living a dozen people to a room. But even with all of that poverty, they still made enough money that they could send it back home to fund guns for a self-defense group.
I want to talk about the role the Bund played compared to and alongside other revolutionary forces across the empire, particularly how they fit into the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Interestingly, it was the same 1903 Congress of the RSDLP that occasioned the historic Bolshevik and Menshevik split. It was at that same party Congress where Trotsky and Martov, two prominent Jewish socialists, denounced what they saw as the Bund's Jewish exceptionalism in their proposal demand for an autonomously organized Jewish section of the party for Jewish comrades. And it seems like you're telling a story here that connects these different debates of a very complex party Congress, but that connects them as kind of a moment that privileges cadre over mass and party over class. What do you make of this moment in the history of international socialism and the simultaneous divides that emerged over autonomous Jewish organization and also the role of mass organization and mass trade union politics in the socialist movement?
So before I get into this, I have to give a little caveat about how I approach writing about movement history, which is unconventional and perhaps heretical for a historian. So having been in, leftist movements my whole life and having a father, who's a Marxist, who's also been in leftist movements, I believe that there is a huge difference between the text that is read in the resolution or the justification that is given in the party newspaper and the actual reasons things happen. I believe that there are many things that are promoted as matters of high ideals that actually come down to personal beef. I believe that often you will have someone who fucked someone else's girlfriend, and the guy who was cheated on will denounce that guy not for breaking up his relationship, but for being an imperialist. And I think that in the way I told the story about what went down in the 1903 Russian Social Democratic Labor Party conference, it is very influenced by my belief that personal beefs are a major force of history. So let me give some context. In 1903, the Bund was the largest revolutionary party in the entire Tsarist Empire. They had 30,000 members. They were a mass party. They were also a part of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which had 5,000 members, even though the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party represented everyone in the entire Russian Empire, and the Bund represented a group that made up 2% of the empire tops. But the disputes between the Bund and the larger Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and the disputes between the Bund and Lenin and Trotsky, they don't come out of the Russian Empire. They come out of debates in a place that I call exile land. Exile land is the term I use to refer to this sort of network of Western European cities where exiled Russian revolutionaries live, fight, spar, have sexual liaisons, print pamphlets, and plot for their glorious return to the homeland. And the people who inhabit exile land are intellectuals. They are not foul-smelling young factory workers like my great-grandfather. These are fancy boys and girls, and usually boys, who write pamphlets. And they also are people who spend all of their time in an incredibly incestuous world arguing with each other and debating. This is the world they come from. Bundists, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, Socialist Revolutionary, Zionist, Polish Socialist Party, doesn't matter. These are people who have spent so much time in little tiny rooms yelling at each other over theory that they have developed true and deep hatreds of each other of the type that only people of the most incestuous scenes know. So that's the context. Now, the Bund starts viewing their demand for an autonomous Jewish organization. What they want for Jews is they just want the removal of racist laws and the freedom from racist violence. That's what they want. But as the 19th century turns into the 20th, Bundists like John Mill, who is very influenced by the Polish Socialist Party, start thinking a little bit differently. And they start saying, why do we look down so much on our own language and culture? Look at the Poles, right? Polish is banned. Polish education is banned by the Russian Empire. And look at the pride, right, that with which they fight for their repressed language and culture. Why are we so different? Why do we spit on our language and culture like it's nothing and, think it's better to just, speak in Russian, the language of empire? Why? Doesn't our culture, doesn't our language deserve the same dignity as Russian or Polish or French? And he starts developing the idea that there should be a positive program for the promotion of Eastern European Jewish culture. And this is not a separatist thing. It's not like we all want to, move out to Bialystok and build a wall around it. The idea is that as people living in an ultra-diverse, ultra-multicultural society, that everyone in that society should have the right to speak their own language, to educate their kids in their own culture, to have cultural institutions like newspapers and theaters, to vote in their language, to represent themselves in court in their language, that all of the languages of this vast empire should be treated with equal dignity. And Yiddish should be one of those languages. And they call this principle national cultural autonomy, but in a lot of ways, it would be very similar to the sort of multiculturalism that we would recognize in New York, where in my neighborhood, I can file a ballot in Yiddish. I can buy a Yiddish magazine. If I wanted to, I could send my kid to a school that was, teaching in Spanish or in Haitian Creole. I can buy newspapers from a dazzling variety of languages. This is an idea that is so common in our daily lives as Americans in diverse cities that it almost doesn't seem revolutionary, but it really, really was. Because the other answer for what you should do with the fact that there are all these diverse groups in these big empires is that you should have a whole bunch of bloody border wars where you mutually ethnically cleanse each other until you each have a homeland. And the Bund thought this was fucking dumb. And they were like, nope, multiculturalism, mutual respect, everyone stays in their homes. They, should get state support for the promotion of their own culture, especially if it's a subaltern oppressed one. And we fight together for a better and more beautiful world. That's the Bundist idea. Now, at the same time, Russia is also going through some pretty horrific pogroms, including one in 1903 in a city called Kishinev, which becomes a massive international black mark on Russia because Kishinev is a city that's close to the border, and foreign press is able to come in and they're able to photograph the corpses and the desecrated Torah scrolls. And it just becomes more than an act of mass murder. It becomes like a symbol of everything that is evil and rotten and blood-soaked with about the Tsarist Empire. And so this very raw, painful, visceral horror at the violence against Jews. This is something really, alive in these young Bundists in exile land. So in various Bundist party congresses leading up to the Russian Social Democratic Party Congress of 1903, they create the demand that the Bund will be considered the sole representative of the Jewish proletariat. In some ways, this is based on like their theories about national culture. In some ways, this is based on their belief that they need to, be strong enough to defend Jewish people. But there's something else, and this is the thing that has to do with my personal views on how history is shaped, and perhaps a bunch of Jacobin boys will dislike what I say, but this is my view. At the same time as the Bund is, arguing about nationalism and arguing about Yiddish language rights, a world historical figure who's not yet world historical has made his appearance in exile land. And that man is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, aka Lenin. And he immediately becomes like Plekhanov's number one disciple. He's so forceful. He is so iron-willed. He is such a fucking dick to everyone who disagrees with him. He is the dictator of the book club. Like this, when you read memoirs about what Lenin is like in 1901, 1902, you're like, my God, I know that man. My God. He is the person screaming that you're an imperialist running dog because you made a different schedule for who watches the dishes afterwards. That's him. He is someone where it's like his way or the highway. And him and Yuli Martov, who was, a member of the Vilna group, but has since gone in a completely different direction, they create this newspaper that's called Iskra. And Iskra devotes a lot of its time to attacking other socialists that they don't view as being true representatives of what socialism should be. They spend so much time attacking socialists who disagree with them, and the Bund is one of the groups that they are constantly attacking. And the Bundists hate Vladimir Lenin. They hate him on a personal level. You read Bundist memoirs, and they describe him as like a crafty Russian grain merchant with a sly smile as if he doesn't believe a word he's saying. They peg him as a tyrant in waiting. They think that he's a liar, that he is like constantly like Machiavellianly scheming. They hate how he's always denouncing other socialists. They hate him. And in my opinion, a lot of the reason that the Bund is so concerned with being the sole representative of the Jewish proletariat is not actually about the theoretical reasons that they claim they are so concerned with it. It's because they view this as a way to shore up their own autonomous power against Lenin and his buddies. And especially when you think about the position of strength they're in, right? Like they have 6 times as many members as the rest of the RSDLP. They have all the best printing presses. They have a lot more money than the rest of the RSDLP has because they have all these like New York sweatshop workers giving them money. They run all the smuggling
They want to
routes.
consolidate and protect their turf.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, why should we fucking subjugate ourselves to this like these rinky-dink, disagreeable boys run by the most disagreeable boy in the world? No. And so they make up a theoretical excuse. This is my opinion. Many people will disagree with me on this. I look forward to the many denunciations of me for personalizing history. This is what I believe. Anyway, so the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Party, which begins in Belgium and after some terse meetings with the Belgian police, moves to London, is the scene of some momentous splits. And everything about the Congress from the first day sort of proves why the Bund hates dealing with Lenin. He has done all sorts of like little parliamentary moves to make sure that all of his supporters are stacking all of the committees. He's made sure that the Bund has like way less representatives than they ought to have. He has worked with Plekhanov to make sure that like the Bund status is the first thing on the menu. So everyone is like bright and fresh, to really argue about this shit. He's really good at parliamentarianism and he's real sneaky at it. And so they come in, everything is stacked against them. The first thing that's brought up is how they should not be the sole representatives of the Jewish proletariat. And after 6 weeks of arguing that is both so dull and so mendacious to read that I get panic attacks from it. Like I had to suffer through the minutes of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. I don't recommend it. I don't believe in trigger warnings, but this is like trigger warning, worst DSA meeting ever. That's the only way to describe it. You just start shaking from the combination of like boredom and bad faith that you only will know if you've spent a lot of time on the left. But Eventually, the Trotsky and Martov, who are both allied with Lenin at this time, they lead the charge for the Bund status as the sole representative of the Jewish proletariat to be put up for a vote. Everyone votes against the Bund except the Bund, and the Bund, they storm off and leave. Now, the thing that's kind of interesting about them storming off and leaving is, for me, it really represents a fatal weakness in the Bund that they will repeat over and over again, which is that when they're in moments where they're dealing with people they loathe, but they're in a space where they have power, and that power is like limited, the power is contested, things are fraught, but nonetheless they still have some power, they have a real tendency to just flounce out of the room instead and to abdicate their power. And this will become much more significant later during the Russian Revolution of 1917, foreshadowing. But after the Bund leaves, taking their 3 votes with them, the next issue comes up, which is whether the party should be, a mass party like Yulia Martov supports, or whether the party should be a party of highly disciplined cadre that answer to leadership, aka Lenin. And without the Bund's 3 votes, Lenin's proposal wins. And this is what allows Lenin to take on the term majorityite for his faction. And in Russian, majorityite translates to Bolshevik.
And obviously, it's kind of clear where your sympathies lie in various debates, but you also have a complex assessment in that, even though you kind of favor the Menshevik line in this debate, you very much fault the Bund for lacking the sort of practical ruthlessness to stay and fight for that position.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, when I think about what leftists can learn from the Bund, there's all sorts of positive things they can learn from it. But one of the other things is you got to stay in that room and fight ruthlessly for your position, because if you don't, if you leave that room, if you flounce out in the name of principle, then your enemy takes the power that you've ceded.
Many of the most prominent figures in the European socialist movement, as we've referenced already, were Jews. Julius Martov, Rosa Luxemburg, we can go back to Karl Marx, and so on and so on. And this is, of course, a fact that anti-Semitic reactionaries murderously seize on. But many Jews were Bundists. Many Jewish socialists were not. You write, quote, "Believers in neither God nor tribe, they denied that there was such a thing as a Jewish people." What accounts, in your view, for these diametrically opposed instincts among Jews, on the part of different Jews, with respect to their own ethnic and or religious inheritance and community, and their profound commitment to socialism? I mean, ironically, there seems something very Jewish about just the divergence in and of itself.
I mean, in a lot of ways, I think I personally would fall more on like the Rosa Luxemburg part of the spectrum, like just in terms of how I live my own life, how I organize in my own life. Even though obviously I'm in love with the Bund. No one would spend 7 years writing a book about people they didn't love a bit. I think that there's a few things. I mean, I think some of it actually has to do with your own personal experience of what being Jewish meant. So for someone like Leon Trotsky, he did not grow up in a Jewish community. His father was like one of the only Jewish farmers in the Russian Empire. He took part in like a farming scheme where he moved out to like this part of Ukraine where there were like barely any other Jewish people. And, he was a Jewish kulak. There was only one. That was like Trotsky's dad, right? Trotsky, he didn't go to Jewish religious school. He didn't speak Yiddish. He grew up in this world. He's a very assimilated dude, right? And I think that he probably experienced being Jewish mostly in terms of the racism that people levied against him. I mean, throughout his entire life, even though he, didn't give a lick about his own ethnic identity, he was constantly being referred to as Trotsky Bronstein and, being painted in disgusting caricatures with stars of David on him as a devil, eating blood. I mean, he was a figure that attracted so much racism, while himself just like being very, in my opinion, uninterested in matters of anyone's ethnic identity at all. The same with like Rosa Luxemburg. Like she moved in this like very cosmopolitan, like European, multilingual milieu. She was living in like Germany. She left Poland, fairly early in her life, and her organizing there. And I think like in the worlds that they lived in, what being Jewish meant to them was that people were racist against you. And what they thought would be the best thing for Jews would be if people stopped being racist against them. They didn't see it as like, a positive cultural identity. They saw it as more like a caste. You know what I mean? Like something that you were stuck in by dint of medieval prejudice and racism. And that if they just got rid of the laws and if people just stopped being such fucking bigots, you would just like assimilate and be like everyone else. That's especially because they weren't religious, And I think that the Bundists, they came from a very different milieu, right? They came from a milieu where even though a lot of them themselves were pretty assimilated when they were young, the people they were organizing, they spoke Yiddish. They lived sometimes in places that were like 60% Jewish. They lived in these like very close-knit Jewish communities. And the idea of like arguing about what a Jew was, it would have been ridiculous to them. It would have been so silly. They're like, it's the guy. It's like Shlomo over there speaking Yiddish. That's who a Jewish person is. What do you mean? It's like, I don't know, it's this entire neighborhood. It's like the Podil neighborhood of Kiev. Like, what are you talking about? And so I think, and I also think, a lot of it had to do with the fact that the Bundists were ground level organizers in Jewish communities, right? Like Trotsky, himself was an organizer. He was organizing in Odessa, when he was young, across all sorts of lines. He was not like going to Pale of Settlement towns. He was not going to like Bialystok and trying to organize Jewish workers. And so his experience of organizing, his sort of formation as an activist was very, very, very different. And, I imagine that the idea that like Jews had to just like stick with organizing the Jewish proletariat and that this like specifically Jewish organization would like represent all proletarian Jews must have seemed so constricting, right? To someone like Trotsky or to Yuliy Martov for that matter. Also, there's a quote that Yuliy Martov gave that I thought really summed up the argument against Jewish specific organizing. And remember, Yuliy Martov is the same guy that in 1895, he's a member of the Vilna group who is intellectually crystallizing the idea that Jews are oppressed as both a race and a class. Like he crystallizes it 2 years before the Bund.
He's an innovator of this.
Yeah,
concept.
He is the innovator of this concept. So the fact that 8 years later he changed his mind is quite significant. And this is what he says. However perfect the organization of that relatively insignificant section which Jews constitute may be, so long as the organization of the vast majority of the proletariat of heavy industry limps on both legs, the most intensive and dedicated work in its own little corner will not yield even a tenth of the result which it could produce. So what he's saying, he's like, Jews are 2% of the empire. They work in industries like brush making, leather tanning instead of steel mills or trains. And so even if you organize the Jewish proletariat in the most perfect way possible, and they are so fucking enlightened and they are so revolutionary, and these are like the creme de la creme of activists in the entire earth, even if you do that, it doesn't matter because they're 2% of the Russian Empire and they don't work in any heavy industries. So you can't actually cause a revolution with it. It's a very practical way of looking at things. It's almost a practicality and a concern for building power that I think a lot of people would find anathema today, but I totally see where he's coming from. He's quite correct, actually. So I think in a lot of ways, the Bunds had an approach to ethnicity that would be more similar to, like, let's say, a union organizer in New York who was organizing dishwashers who were mostly Latino. So the union organizer speaks Spanish and you celebrate Three Kings Day and all of this, versus someone who is an intellectual who is writing about unionization writ large.
I'm Naomi Klein, and you're listening to The Dig, my go-to podcast for the most thoughtful, in-depth conversation on the left. It's an incredible place to be exposed to new ideas and new writing. And if you can, please become a sustaining supporter at Patreon.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com. and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Femmephilia, Love Letters to Trans Mermaids, Queer Mothers, and Marilyn Monroe by Sophie Lewis. In the original and provocative essays collected in Femmephilia, Sophie Lewis makes the case for the vital importance of politicized feminists, a feminism that is self-consciously artificial, extravagant in its erotic and political appetites, and staunchly anti-work, abolitionist, and utopian. Femme laborers deserve our care, respect, and support. But instead, they face dismissal from masculinist antagonists and feminist allies alike. Where neoliberal women's empowerment has failed to combat the eruption of right-wing anti-trans and anti-feminist attacks, Lewis argues that Femmephilia can help us imagine a radical future, a new logic of liberation for all feminized people. Find Femmephilia at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Let's turn to the Russian Revolution of 1905. What role did the Bund play alongside other socialist and popular organizations across the Russian Empire in this historic uprising? And did the Bund glimpse at various moments, did they glimpse their dream of a multi-ethnic working class power coming true?
In the western provinces of the Russian Empire, the Bund was one of the most important, most powerful forces in the 1905 revolution. Whether it was on the barricades of Łódź or whether it was on the port of Odessa when the battleship Potemkin pulled in, Bundists were orators, they were fighters, they were pamphlet and weapons smugglers. They were some of the premier ideologues and also the premier fighters in this amazing moment of violence, of tumult, and of hope. I think about Anna Lipschitz. She was a young Bundist speaker. She was in her early 20s. Her sister, Esther, had been tortured to death by the political police. And there she was on the Odessa port as the star speaker. The press nicknamed her the Fury. She was so famous and so iconic that she even gets her own cameo in Sergei Eisenstein's The Battleship Potemkin. He immortalizes this one moment when secret police in the crowd try to instigate against Anna by using racist slurs against her. But instead of this working the way the police had hoped, Anna incited the crowd against them and they beat the cops to death. In Łódź, the young Virgil Kahin, a leader of self-defense groups, was essentially the king of the barricade fighting there. In the small town of Krynki in Poland, Bundists and Polish socialists worked together to literally take over the city. They kicked out the cops. They took over the municipal liquor storage warehouses and broke open all the crates so that people couldn't just do the usual thing that derailed revolutionary moments and get extremely drunk. And they held power for several days until the military was called in to drive them out. In the old city of Vilna, the Bundist playwright A. Weider was the most popular man in the city. He led the self-defense forces. He kicked the cops out of the old town. I mean, when I read stories of this moment, you can feel the thrill that people must have felt from the distance of a century. People talk about these areas that are called birges. These were workers' boulevards where, people would hang out, try to get day labor jobs, but also where revolutionaries would organize. These birges became temporary autonomous zones. Bundists were authorities in the Pale of Settlement. They were mediating disputes that rabbis would mediate, like broken engagements. They were mediating broken engagements. Their authority was such. Bundists were figures of almost impossible authority and glamour during those first months of the revolution. And they weren't doing it alone, right? Like, they were fighting alongside other socialists. They were fighting alongside Ukrainians, alongside Poles, alongside Russians. And, one of the things that really, really struck me when I was reading these histories was how important the Bund thought the education of the Christian working class was. They knew that the Tsarist Empire kept people deliberately, ignorant in order to use racism as a wedge. And so from the earliest days of the revolution, Bundists were like, how do we fight against that? They published pamphlets to educate peasants on the fact that it wasn't the Jews who were fucking them over. It was the Tsarist officials and the landlords. They helped Christians organize labor unions. In Riga, Maxim, a Bundist orator, he actually organized all of the Christian railway workers in Riga, an essential thing to taking over the city. They didn't just fight alongside pre-existing socialist groups that were made of non-Jews. They actually even helped found new ones, because they knew that the actual thing that you needed to prevent racist violence was you needed an organized working class.
And then why was the revolution of 1905 defeated? What sort of shape did the reaction take, and what specifically were the consequences of that defeat for the Bund and more generally for Jews across the empire, as revolution was framed as Jewish conspiracy? You narrate the aftermath of 1905. Quote, "The pogroms forced Jewish socialists to face the hostility of much of the Christian working class. Jews and Christians had struck, demonstrated, and died together in 1905. They draped their friends' coffins in red flags and marched to the cemetery together, where they gave speeches about the international brotherhood of working men. Then the pogroms began, and the Christian workers vanished or joined in."
In October of 1905, after a general strike brings economic activity in the empire to a halt, the Tsarist government is forced to make concessions. After 4 days of a general strike, the technocratic minister, Count Sergei Witte, convinced Tsar Nicholas II that he was going to have to offer some sort of concession to the revolution. And he forces the Tsar to issue this manifesto that's called the October Manifesto. And it offers pretty middling and petty, quote unquote, rights. There's the right to a parliament called the Duma, but the parliament doesn't really have any power. There's the right to a free press, except it can be censored. There's the right to vote for only a few people in limited circumstances. But this document is enough to kind of buy off the liberal support of the revolution. The release of the October Manifesto, though, is greeted with ecstasy by everyone at first, because it's not that the rights in it are so good. It's the fact that this autocrat, this motherfucker who thought that he got his power from God himself, had been forced to give up the smallest fraction of his autocracy. And he had been forced to do it by a movement of the working people. This was huge. And so when the October Manifesto was announced, crowds of revolutionaries all over the Russian Empire, crowds of just ordinary people, workers, poor people, they went onto the street to celebrate. And as if it was coordinated, Cossacks and military police shot up those celebrations all over the empire. It was as if the Tsar could not make this concession without at the same time showing that he had the power to mutilate and to kill. Now, at the same time as these sort of mass shootings and attacks on demonstrators are taking place, a wave of pogroms breaks out across the Russian Empire. Over 12 days, pogroms break out in 690 different places. everywhere from like tiny little towns to massive cities like Odessa and Kiev. And these pogroms they're not a matter of like a few people being murdered. These are acts of spectacular and apocalyptic bloodshed that are meant to put Jews in their place, because the Tsar blamed Jews for the revolution. In Odessa, over the course of a few days, nearly 800 Jews are murdered. Thousands upon thousands more are made homeless when their houses are burned. And these pogroms are carried out in large part by organizations that are collectively referred to as the Black Hundreds. These are proto-fascist, genocidally anti-Semitic, pro-monarchy organizations. And the biggest Black Hundreds organization is called the Union for the Russian People. It is an organization that is so buddy-buddy with the government that the Tsar wears its pin when he goes to parties. The Tsar allows members of this organization to vacation at his summer home. In my book, I write about how if you were someone in America observing how the local sheriff put on a Klan hood and led the mass murders of the Black part of town, the violence that was happening in Russia would have seemed very, very familiar to you. And for that reason, the Black press in America was covering these pogroms in Russia with scrupulous detail, because they were seeing this melding of the state and of the mob in order to use racism to crush popular dissent. Now, the pogroms alone were not enough to crush the revolutionary wave, and neither were these initial shootings and repressions of protesters. The revolutionary wave is crushed by a combination of military defeat. Armed revolutionaries in Moscow try to take over the government. The Tsarist army puts them down viciously. Hundreds are murdered. There's also the fracturing of the coalition as workers who, they're hungry, right? After so long on strike. There's a scene in my book where Raphael Abramovich, who is a Bundist leader, talks to a coachman about why the coachman no longer supports the revolution. And the coachman basically says, comrade, human solidarity is all well and good, but a horse needs oats, and the Soviet has no oats to give him. And after the revolutionary wave is just kind of crushed with this mixture of, fragmentation, brute violence, pogroms, racism, the liberals being bought off by minor reforms, there is another wave of arrests and repression, because the remaining revolutionaries are exposed, right? They're no longer part of this giant mass movement. And hundreds upon hundreds of people are executed. Huge numbers of people are sent to Siberia, to internal exile or to prison camps. And countless Bundists flee the empire. You only have to quote numbers if you want to see how devastating the failed 1905 revolution was for the Bund. In 1903, the Bund had 30,000 members. In 1907, it had 609 members. The violence, the repression, the failure, it convinced a lot of Jews, Bundist or not, that there was no place for them in Russia. And many of the Bund's top orators, people like Baruch Charny-Vladek, labor organizers like David Dubinsky, these people decided, to hell with this. There is no chance of liberating Russia. It is time to leave for somewhere better. And these people left for New York City, where they became massive leaders in the burgeoning American socialist labor movement.
You dedicate a lot of attention in the book to Bundist leaders' places of refuge when they recurrently went into exile, places of, as you just mentioned and we discussed earlier, there were places of emigration like New York, but there was this network of locations that you call exile land, where Bundists and really every sort of radical current fleeing the severe repression in the Russian Empire went to: Paris, Geneva, Berlin, even Istanbul. Often the center of activity for the movement, at least for these leading participants, it wasn't in the Pale or even in the Empire. It was wherever they fled to stay safe, conduct meetings, congresses, produce pamphlets, do the work of the revolution, but outside of the place where the revolution is supposed to happen. And I think it's rare to read a study of such a place-based organization and movement that's so thoroughly international, with all of these various hubs of frantic activity distributed across different states, different empires, amid shifting borders. Why did those scenes speak to you so powerfully? What does this many front picture of the Bund teach us about the centrality of internationalism, migration, exile in the history of the socialist movement? And lastly, what sort of internationalism do you feel like it points toward?
I mean, the story of exiled leadership and exiled intellectuals is something that's common to all revolutionary movements. Everyone from Ho Chi Minh to the Ayatollah Khomeini to Vladimir Lenin himself spent major stints in exile. When you're trying to overthrow a repressive government, whether that government is the Shah or whether it's the Tsar, a lot of times you have to skip town or else you end up in prison or dead. This is just a reality of all revolutionary movements, I think. And, that tension, right, between here and there, between the leadership in exile, the PLO in Tunis, right, the Bund in Geneva, whatever that leadership is, this is always just a major part of revolutions, successful ones, failed ones. There's always an exiled leadership. There's always an on-the-ground rank and file. The relations between them are sometimes frayed, sometimes tight. Sometimes the exiled leadership swoops in to take over, one might argue steal, a popular revolution, another common recurrent theme of history. And that's just how things are done. The Bund, I think, so one of the milieus that I talk about a lot in the book is Exile Land, which is this network of Russian radical colonies that's all over Western Europe. And Exile Land is not just a place that the Bund retreats to. This is the stomping grounds of all of the revolutionaries that will shape the future Soviet Union. I mean, Kamenev is from Exile Land, Zinoviev, Trotsky, Lenin, utter exile land, right? Bukharin, Radek. In the context of the Russian Empire, the machinations of thinkers and leadership who are abroad was as important as the on-the-ground organizing inside the empire, sometimes more important. And, the Bund was no exception. And, inside the empire, they're creating labor unions. They are doing self-defense against pogroms. They're educating shtetls. They're setting up, mutual aid. They're doing these very, very practical things. But outside the empire, that's where they are developing theory. It's where they are writing like these formative texts that will then get smuggled into the empire. It's where they're raising money to buy weapons. Those sort of international networks were an absolutely crucial thing for the Bund and for every other revolutionary group, bar none. And I think that sometimes when Jewish groups are talked about, Bundist or Zionist or whatever, there's this idea that these Jewish groups existed in isolation, that there was like a Jewish history which was separate from a Russian history, which was separate from a European history. But in actuality, these Jewish groups were part of this diasporic, exiled, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious revolutionary scene. And they were all interwoven. They all slept with each other. They all owed each other's money. They all had interminable beefs with each other. They all influenced each other, whether positively or negatively. And the dynamics of these incestuous communities in Western Europe were things that fundamentally shaped how the Russian Revolution would shake out.
The Bund was a powerful pole of Jewish politics, sometimes an extraordinarily powerful pole at certain moments in its history. But it wasn't the only political and social force engaged in the struggle for political power in the Pale. There were, of course, more Orthodox religious Jews against whom the sort of Bund was rebelling in many ways. And there were, after 1897, there were Zionists. What was the balance of power between the Bund and these other forces? What did the struggle for political power look like inside the Pale among Jews? And how did the Bund view their Jewish rivals and enemies through the lens of their own socialist ideology?
Jewish politics, I'm going to say something shocking, has always been a pretty disputatious and diverse place.
Get out.
Right? A lot of different players. Yeah. Can you imagine? So in the Pale of Settlement, there were a number of different political actors. There are bourgeois assimilationist Jews who just want to be fancy Russians at the end of the day. There are Jewish Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. There are Jewish socialist revolutionaries. There are Jewish anarchists. Bialystok was a major center for Jewish anarchism. There are, pious Orthodox Jews who have their own disagreements with each other. Not to go on a tangent, but in addition to the Hasidic Jews, there was another very pious Orthodox sect called the Misnagadim, who literally were founded to say Hasidic Jews were doing shit wrong and that you shouldn't be doing ecstatic prayer, you should be doing study. There's a lot of dispute, right? And there were Zionists. And, people sometimes imagine that the Zionist movement was a single thing because it was able to act in a cohesive and unified way in the creation of Israel and in doing the Nakba. But the Zionist movement was a divided movement. You had fancy pants bourgeois Zionists like Theodor Herzl. You also had a movement that was called labor Zionism. And labor Zionism is a very interesting and wacky movement that people like to bring up now when they're trying to make apologia for Zionism, because they're like, oh, the labor Zionists were socialist. But I want to just talk a little bit about what labor Zionism was. So labor Zionism was led by a guy named Ber Borichov, who was in the same milieu as the Bund. And the idea of it was that Jews were not able to develop into economically normal people because of their position as a minority in Europe. And what did he mean by economically normal? He meant that Jews were not doing big dick, manly man, hammer swinging jobs like steel mills or, coal mining. Borichov meant that Jews were just doing, how do I put this? Effeminate and weak jobs like tailoring or shoemaking. And by the way, this is so asinine. People should try to think about what it would be like to live in a society without shoemakers for 5 minutes and think about how stupid it was, how these jobs were demeaned. But anyway, the idea was that if Jews wanted to become big dick, broad shoulder, manly hammer swingers, they could not keep existing as a minority in Europe. They had to go to Palestine. And in Palestine, they would set up a Jewish state with Jewish socialists and Jewish capitalists and Jewish workers, Jewish exploiters, and eventually the Jewish workers would do a revolution against the Jewish exploiters, and there would be communism. This was the great idea that Borichov had. And Borichov did not think that there were going to be issues between the Palestinians in Palestine and Jews who were coming in to colonize, because he thought that they were essentially the same, but that Palestinians were kind of lesser. And in order to make an example of what a great situation it was going to be in Palestine, he looked at Liberia, where he was like, yeah, the African-American settlers, they were like brothers to the Kru people they colonized in Liberia. That went great. It'll be the same in Palestine. Borichov did not go to Palestine. This was a pamphlet-based view. Now, labor Zionist groups like Polei Zion were major competitors to the Bund. though they were always less popular than them. Labor Zionist groups also tried to organize labor unions, also tried to organize resistance against pogroms. But the Bundists were a more powerful faction. In addition to labor Zionism and the sort of bourgeois Herzl Zionism, there was also what is called revisionist Zionism. And revisionist Zionism's leader was a guy named Zev Jabotinsky. He also came from the same social milieu as the Bund. He, in fact, dated Sofia Dubnova, who would become the wife of the Bund's leader in Poland. And revisionist Zionism believed in strength, they believed in cruelty, they believed in military conquest of both banks of the River Jordan, and they believed that the cringing, shrinking Jew of the diaspora, Jabotinsky often used the slur Yid to describe this Jew. They believed that this cringing, shrinking, effeminate, weak Jew of the diaspora had to be remade into a big, strong, brutish, tall Hebrew, to use Jabotinsky's words. And talk about self-hating, right? And Jabotinsky believed that military discipline and violence and conquest was how you were going to remake the Jewish man. And in the Pale of Settlement, Zionism was always more associated with the bourgeoisie. The Bundists always thought the idea of socialist Zionism was inane because they were like, okay, you call yourself socialists, but you can't actually live for one day in Palestine without getting infusions of cash from bourgeois Jewish organizations. Zionism was always intensely dependent on Jewish philanthropy, which, like all philanthropy, largely derives from the wealthy. And so because of that, it was always in the hock to the elites.
The Bund maintained an extraordinarily sharp, very prescient critique of Zionism from the get-go. And they maintained that critique all the way through the Holocaust and then through the foundation of the State of Israel in the Nakba in 1948. They consistently argued that the imposition of a Jewish state on an Arab majority would require a state of perpetual warfare, which turns out true. How was it that the Bund's ideology equipped it to understand Zionism so quickly and so clearly, so much more clearly, of course, than really like the entirety of the American ruling class today, even though today's ruling class has all of the very clear hindsight of history to look back upon?
I think they understood Zionism because it's actually pretty easy to see through Zionism if you look at what it is and you also consider Palestinians to be equal humans. But I'll sort of go through the Bund's critique of Zionism because they hated Zionists from the start. I have quotes from 1901 where Chaim Weizmann, who's the future leader of the State of Israel, says that everywhere Zionists' hardest struggle is conducted against the Jewish Labor Bund. And the same year, Bundists are calling Zionists the most evil enemy of the organized Jewish proletariat. This is the level of just like oil and water hatred between these two groups. And there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, first, Bundists thought Zionism was wildly impractical. The idea that millions of people would leave their homes and become collective farmers in the Levant was an inanity to them. They hated how, from the very start, Zionist leaders were willing to cut deals with anti-Semites. There's a moment in my book where, in 1903, the Bundist leader Vladimir Medem goes to one of the World Zionist Congresses as an observer. And on stage, Theodor Herzl brags about setting up a meeting with Vyacheslav von Plehve, who is a notoriously racist minister of the interior that most Jews hold responsible for the Kishinev pogroms. But Herzl doesn't care. He does not care if the person who he's trying to cut deals with murdered Jews because he is purely Machiavellian and he just cares about colonizing land in Palestine. The Bund also had a philosophical disagreement with Zionists at a time when so many powers in Europe viewed Jews as swarthy, Oriental, eternal alien others who ought to get out. Zionists agreed. Zionists also thought Jews had no place in Europe. But in addition to all of these things, Bundists were able to look logically at the situation and say, if you have a place that is almost entirely Palestinian Arab, and you desire to take over land in that place, to make that place majority Jewish, you are going to be in conflict with the people who live there. This is a basic thing that anyone with half a brain cell could realize. If the government of France said that their goal was to acquire even half of New York City and make it so that only French citizens could live there, New Yorkers would be angry at it. No one in the world would like this. No one in the world wants to be kicked out of their homes so that a racially exclusivist entity can be created there. And it takes a lot of self-delusion and, frankly, a lot of white supremacy to not realize this basic fact.
Your book really opens up the wide, diverse world of revolutionary organizations operating across the empire, across the Russian Empire, and more broadly across Europe throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, leading up to the Russian Revolution, which is, of course, a signal event for the Bund and for every revolutionary organization in the empire and everywhere. Bundists, you write, always viewed the Bolsheviks as authoritarian and demagogic from the earliest days of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which we discussed a little earlier on. How did the relationship, we talked about already how the relationship between the Bund and the Bolsheviks started off pretty bad. How did things only get worse leading into 1917? To zoom out, where did the Bund in the months and years leading into the revolution and then through the period of the provisional government fit into the state of competition and conflict with Bolsheviks and also with socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks and the left and right factions of both of those parties, all amid the tumult of the provisional government leading into the Bolshevik Revolution, or, for its detractors, the Bolshevik coup?
Oh, you're going to get some hell for tankies for that one. Well, the Bund rejoined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1907, and they became very close to the Mensheviks. In fact, you have a lot of Bundists who are Mensheviks. Henrik Ehrlich, Mark Lieber. These people would both become prominent Mensheviks and keep their position in the Bund. The way that, you have people who are like big JVP leaders who are also DSA leaders. The Mensheviks and the Bund were like, they were like sister organizations in the same party in the years leading up to World War I. Now, I want to just talk for a moment about what World War I meant, not just for the Bund, but for Jews in Russia, because it's really important that listeners understand that, to understand the position that the Bund is in when the revolution breaks out in February. The start of World War I was a calamity for the Jews of the Western Russian Empire. The Tsarist army considered Jews to be a fifth column, and there were mass deportations from major Jewish cities like Dvinsk. These are sort of an entire city that was like a third Jewish just being emptied out over the course of a few weeks, like people just being shoved into boxcars with what they could carry and being dumped out in the interior of Russia, and then having their Christian neighbors loot their homes. Jewish life was radically dispersed by these deportations. The Pale of Settlement was destroyed in practice, even though it still had the force of law. And in addition to the deportations, there were also massive roundups at the start of the war of all sorts of suspected radicals, but particularly Jewish ones. And a number of major Bundist leaders find themselves in Siberian exile. Now, when the war starts, The Russian troops initially have some successes, and they are able to take some land in the Habsburg Empire, where Jews have lived in a state of like quasi-equality. Jews in the Habsburg Empire are in such a better position than they are in Russia, and largely are extremely loyal Habsburg citizens. And when the Russian army sweeps in, they steal these people's land, they butcher them, they kick them out of their government jobs. It is a disaster that creates mass refugee waves towards Budapest and towards Vienna of Habsburg Jews that are fleeing these marauding hordes. Then the German and the Habsburg armies start to win. And as the Russian army flees from the collapsing front, they blame all of their military losses on the Jews, old story, and start doing a series of horrific pogroms as they're pushed back. In this diary by S. Ansky, who's a major Jewish playwright who's doing aid during the war, he talks about how in my great-grandfather's hometown, the Russian army forced men to strip naked and ride pigs, and then just shot a bunch of people, just 'cause, why not? And the Pale of Settlement becomes an incredibly bloody front line. Then, as the war progresses, Germany and Austria take more land. And major Jewish cities like Warsaw, Łódź, Vilna fall behind enemy lines, Lublin. The German army advances farther and farther east, and the areas that they take are the areas of the Pale of Settlement. So by 1917, a vast percentage of Russia's Jews are now cut off from Russia. They are under German and Austrian occupation, and frankly in a much better position than they were before, because for all of Germany and Austria's problems, they were a hell of a lot better than the Tsarist Empire. So major Bundist leaders like Vladimir Medem, for instance, he's liberated from a Tsarist jail in Warsaw by the advance of the German army. And in the areas that are controlled by the Germans, the Bund is allowed to more or less freely operate. They're allowed to set up soup kitchens. They're allowed to set up communal organizations, labor unions. Sometimes they're repressed, but in general, not so much. And from the time that these Western provinces fall under German occupation, the trajectory of the Bundists there goes an entirely different way than the Bundists that are in Russia. Now, I want to mention something else too, which is that St. Petersburg, Russia's capital, which has now been renamed Petrograd to sound less Russian, is not a Jewish center, and neither is Moscow. These are places that the vast majority of Jews were banned from living in. And so the Bund in these places is essentially a debate society of well-off professionals. It's not a mass organization the way that it is in Warsaw or Minsk or Łódź or Vilna. It's a reading group, right? And the Bundists that are there are largely acting more as Mensheviks than as Bundists. And in my book, I follow Henrik Ehrlich, he's a Bundist leader. He's a labor lawyer, a radical. He's married to my favorite character, avant-garde poet and revolutionary Sofia Dubnova. But in terms of what he's doing in Petrograd in the years leading up to the Russian Revolution, he's essentially being like a Menshevik political operator, which is not a contradiction. Remember, the Mensheviks and the Bund and the Bolsheviks at this point are all in the same party. Now, the Russian Revolution, the first Russian Revolution of March, is not a revolution that is led by any revolutionary party. It is a revolution that starts on International Women's Day, 1917, when the working women of Petrograd decide that they are done having their men murdered in a stupid meat grinder war, and that they are done with the famine, and within a few days that they are done with the Tsar that is causing all of it. The revolution that breaks out is a people's revolution that owes nothing to any party. It is born of the streets. It is born of poor and working people who attack the troops, who call on each other to overthrow the government that's oppressing them. And it is also born from the young men conscripted into the Tsarist army who do not want to die in a stupid meat grinder war and who do not want to shoot up crowds of women who look like their mothers. Within a few days of these massive street protests breaking out in Petrograd, revolutionaries march to the only democratic body that exists in the entire Tsarist Empire. And that is the Duma, this impotent, powerless, not particularly democratically elected, but kind of democratic body that is headquartered in Tauride Palace. And it's at this moment when these masses of impoverished women, factory workers, and military deserters converge on Tauride Palace to demand leadership from the Duma, that a young, charismatic, extremely vain socialist lawyer named Alexander Kerensky makes his first appearance in history. Unlike all of the other bourgeois vacillating stuffed shirts in the Duma, Kerensky realizes that this is a moment that these previously powerless parliamentarians can now seize the revolution themselves and they can take leadership of it. And Kerensky goes out to greet the masses as heroes. And within about a day, Kerensky and other more or less progressive representatives on the Duma band together and they create what's called the provisional government, which will be considered by foreign countries and officialdom as the official government of revolutionary Russia. But another force is also being created. And while one group of protesters is converging on Tauride Palace, another group of protesters is going to Peter and Paul Fortress. The protesters converge on Peter and Paul Fortress, where a bunch of political troublemakers, dissidents, leftists, and socialists are locked up, including some guys who have been involved in creating a coordinating council that was particularly important during the previous revolution in 1905. It was called Dum Dum Dum, a Soviet. And these socialists also hurry to Tauride Palace. Among them is a Bundist named Henrik Ehrlich. And together, these socialists form a coordinating committee and send out delegates to all of the factories and army garrisons to ask for representatives. And all of those people together will create a new Soviet, the Petrograd Soviet, which is the actual democratic street level power of the revolution. So imagine the scene, right? You have on the right side of Tauride Palace is the official democratic body, the provisional government. And on the left side, left wing of Tauride Palace, is the actual chaotic street level, grassroots, cacophonous democracy of workers and especially soldiers, particularly important soldiers. And these two bodies, the official body, provisional government, and the unofficial power, the Soviet, will be the twin poles that will come together to try to guide the revolution in its early months and will eventually pull the revolution apart. Bundists were involved with the Petrograd Soviet from the very start. It was created in part by Henrik Ehrlich. Mark Lieber, another prominent Bundist, as soon as he was able to escape from Siberian exile, he immediately took a prominent position. And in the early months of the revolution, it is a sort of ecstasy for the Bund. First, all laws that discriminate against people based on nationality, religion, or aristocratic rank are rescinded. The Pale of Settlement is destroyed forever. The restrictions on education fall. Jews are allowed to participate in government. The New York Times is reporting with astonishment that a Jewish guy named Mr. Epstein is now the police chief of Minsk. And For the first time, Jews are equal citizens. The Bund becomes a legal organization. They take over an office in Nevsky Prospect, the swishest, fanciest avenue in Petrograd. They march with their Yiddish flags as an equal party. They host their first legal events. There's like these very touching moments that I found describing the Bund's first legal event in Petrograd, where there's all these old people there, people who, were deep friends who have been kept apart by years in prison and exile. They have gray hair now. They're frail. They're looking around and they're like, who are all these new kids who joined the party? They're trying to pretend that they're still young themselves, as if all of these years haven't passed. And they're in complete wonder. Also, a Bundist named Mark Lieber becomes the most charismatic and beloved speaker at Cincelli's circus, the main speaking joint in the city, someone who's carried off by Kronstadt sailors on their shoulders. The whole city seems like a noisy, glorious revolutionary cacophony. But there is a problem. And that problem is that Russia continues to be involved in World War I. Now, when Russia was the Tsarist Empire, the Bund obviously opposed the war. But once the revolution happened, things started to look a little bit different. And this is the moment that I find the most vexatious, baffling, maddening, and idiotic in all of the Bund's history. The Bund decides, through a combination of huffing too much dogmatic Marxist theory and wanting to be respectable with other democratic countries, that they really have to keep in World War I. And I remember reading the minutes of this Bundist conference where Mark Lieber is making this passionate speech about how Russia can't betray its commitments to democratic England and democratic France, and can't abandon poor Serbia and noble Belgium. Oh no. And I feel like I'm watching every single other time in my own lifetime when I've seen a progressive candidate that I got behind defend the indispensable, because defending the indefensible seemed like what a reasonable adult ought to do.
Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks have, whatever one makes of the Bund's critiques of the Bolsheviks, they have a clear line that's also a morally correct and politically intelligent line, which is peace, land, and bread.
So for the first weeks of revolutionary ecstasy, the Bund continues its crowded schedule of conferences, of planning, of giving idiotic speeches in support of World War I because they were huffing too much Marxist theory, all of that, until their old enemy from exile land, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, rolls into Finland Station on April 16th, 1917, gets out of his train car, steps on to the back of an armored truck, and delivers a speech that excoriates every single revolutionary in Russia for their idiocy and their weakness. And he's right. Lenin quickly asserts his control over the Bolsheviks, like he always asserted his control over everything. And he hammers home the simple message of peace, land, and bread. Unlike every other revolutionary party and most other revolutionaries, Lenin is able to see the simple truth that the revolution was caused by World War I, and that soldiers who are lynching their officers, soldiers who are told to take their boots off the corpses of their friends, are not going to continue doing that just because the government changed its name. Lenin knows that the only way for the revolution to survive is to end World War I. And to me, when I read Bundist accounts of the months up until the October revolutions with the sense of doom, there's these memoirs by Raphael Abramovich. He was a Bundist leader who was part of the much smaller anti-war faction, the Bundist internationalists. He's also a Menshevik internationalist. And The moment he gets back into Russia from exile, all he does is try to persuade the Mensheviks, like, guys, we have to stop being in World War I. If we don't leave the war, if Russia doesn't make a separate peace, Lenin is going to take over. We have to make a separate peace. We have to do it while we still have the power. And there's this scene that I didn't put in my book because I had to cut some things, where it was just like tearing at my heart. So Raphael Abramovich, he finally gets an audience with a bunch of these pro-war Mensheviks and pro-war Bundists who are on the Soviet. And he gives this speech where he says, the soldiers are lynching their officers and running away from the front. They overthrew the Tsar because he got them into this war. And if you don't get them out of it, they're going to overthrow you too. You have to get us out of the war while you still have power. And he looks out at the audience, and everyone is just looking at him with blank hostility. And he's just desperate, and he stands on stage and he says, okay, maybe you have a better plan. Tell me, what's your plan to save the great Russian Revolution? And the chairman of the Soviet sort of mutters something about how that's a big question, and they'll get to it later. And he goes off the stage, and a bunch of his comrades afterwards, they come up to him privately and they say, you're totally right. And Abramovich is horrified. And he's like, well, why didn't you back me up then if I was right? And they tell him that it would just be too emotionally difficult for them to go against the Marxist theory of historical development that they think obliged them to support a pro-war government. But really what they mean, in my view, is that they're too afraid to go against the opinions of their friends.
You suggest that the Bund was prescient about the Soviet Union's, about the authoritarian form that it ultimately took, that the outlines of what happened under Stalin were visible under Lenin, though you do not conflate the two. This is probably the part of your book that's most controversial among readers on the left today. What, in your view, did the Bund understand about the Bolsheviks? What, if anything, do you think that the Bolsheviks had right about the Bund? And how, researching and writing this book and now talking to so many people and so many publics about it, do you make your way through this factional minefield?
I mean, to be honest, I've been so overwhelmed with being yelled at by Zionists that I have not had the opportunity to fully relax into being yelled at by tankies yet, though I'm sure it will come. So the truth is the Bolsheviks were authoritarian from the start. This was a faction that was setting up concentration camps by 1919, right? That was shooting fellow socialists and padlocking Soviets from the very earliest days. It was shooting up workers' protests. I mean, it was always authoritarian, and you could argue, okay, maybe they needed that authoritarianism because the world historical role they were playing was such that they had to suppress other leftist groups who would have prevented them from doing that, yada, yada. They were authoritarian. There is no read of Lenin and of the Soviet Union from its very earliest days that does not acknowledge that they were an authoritarian movement that was quite comfortable with killing people, including their fellow leftists. Sorry, that's just the case. I mean, read Victor Serge about 1918. Anything besides that is fantasy, my opinion. I think that the Bund knew the leading Bolsheviks very well. These are people who they had spent, over a decade living next to in very, very close proximity. They knew Lenin's intolerance for dissent. There's another interesting sort of relationship between Bundists and Bolsheviks, which is Felix Dzerzhinsky, will become the first head of the Cheka, the Soviet secret police. He was very close to Bundists when he was young. His fiancée, Julia Goldman, the love of his life, who died in his arms of tuberculosis. Julia was the sister to Mark Lieber, who is a right-wing Bundist leader. He was someone who shared a jail cell with Vladimir Medem, who was, friends with Lieber. These people, he was someone who knew Bundists very well, and Bundists also knew with Dzerzhinsky how much the horrific torture he had underwent in Tsarist jails changed him. I mean, this is a man who nearly had to have his legs amputated because the wounds from his shackles got infected. His jaw was permanently broken askew from being beaten so much. And these things change someone, right? This sort of trauma and abuse changes someone, and the Bund knew that because they knew him very well. And so I think that there was an element of just personal knowledge that the Bundists had of leading Bolsheviks that, influenced how they saw people. But also you have to remember that immediately after the revolution, the Bolsheviks were just really repressive, right? Bolshevik Red Guards shot up protests in support of the Constituent Assembly, which was in January 1918. This was the most cherished organ of revolutionary democracy historically. This was what everything was supposed to be leading towards. But because the Bolsheviks didn't win the majority of delegates on the Constituent Assembly, they shot up pro-assembly protests, killed people, and padlocked the building, right? That's what they did. When workers protested for the 8-hour day that was promised to them, these workers' protests were shot up. In the very earliest days of Soviet rule in Russia, Bundists are repeatedly arrested, threatened with death. Sometimes they have to go on hunger strike to get out of jail. And outside of the centers of St. Petersburg and Moscow, in more Jewish cities in the Pale, like Smolensk, cities that used to have a lot of Bundists on the Soviets, anytime Bundists and Mensheviks won majorities of the Soviets, those Soviets were padlocked. They were shut down. Bundists were executed or sent to concentration camps or simply disappeared. Bundist funerals were shelled. I mean, it didn't take a genius to see that this was repressive. And there's this really great essay by Vladimir Medem, who, interestingly, he was in Poland this whole time. He was not in the Soviet Union, but I think he wrote this in 1918. And he was writing this when Trotsky was perhaps the second most popular man in the Soviet Union. And he wrote, he's like, every day the circle of kosher socialists grows smaller and smaller. Today, Lenin wants to shoot Raphael Abramovich. Who's to say that tomorrow he won't want to shoot Trotsky? And while Lenin never wanted to shoot Trotsky, the state that he built sure did. And I think that just came from the basic insight that if you start your revolutionary project by murdering other socialists, soon you're going to be murdering each other. And I'm sure tankies have a very great reason that they did all that stuff, but for me, my opinions are clear.
Molly Crabapple is an artist and author of 3 books, most recently the New York Times bestseller that we're discussing today, Here Where We Live Is Our Country, the story of the Jewish Bund. She's won 2 Emmys and has work in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. That was part 1 of a 2-part interview. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the question of the relation of political emancipation to religion becomes, for us, the question of the relation of political emancipation to human emancipation. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks, in the summer slightly less frequently. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram and Blue Sky at The Dig Radio. And please do find us wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, please rate and review us. That is very helpful to introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you telling people you know to check out this pod. please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly or annual contribution to help keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is a huge help.